close that. Here we go. And move that. Perfect. Okay, here we go. Okay, so we're going to look at fiscal policy. Fiscal policy, as he pointed out, is just between the president and the House of Representatives. Of course, the Senate has to approve it as well too. But if you notice who's discussing right now to talk about stimulus, it's Nancy Pelosi, which represents the House of Representatives, and Steve Mnuchin, who represents the president, right? You know who's not in there? Mitch McConnell, right? Because the Senate is not that important as far as controlling how the budgets actually work. President and the House of Representatives will really do it. Okay, and those of you who had civics or government already know how that particularly works. Now, there are two tools are going to be taxes and spending. Okay, that's it. That's the only two tools that they have to work with everything. And we'll take a look at how the shifting goes along, but those are going to be the two tools that they have to work with. Okay, so let's kind of recall back a couple of units ago, and we dealt with supply and demand. Supply and demand was for one market only. Okay, so the orange market or the Apple market or the computer market. Now what we're going to look at is aggregate demand. He actually told us what it was in there, so hopefully you caught that. Aggregate means added all together, the amalgamation of everything. So we're going to add everything together. So now we'll look at consumer, business, and government spending. Particularly, we'll look at all the markets. So for consumer, it might be cell phones or Apple products or buying of fruit. Businesses would be buying of factories, tractors, computers. Government spending would be the buying of submarines, for example. We add those all together and we're going to get the aggregate demand, okay? C plus I plus G. That's all we're going to focus on. Now, XN is part of it, but we're going to just ignore that until we get to our international trade, and that's the one that we'll actually focus on at that particular point. Okay. So here's our definition of aggregate demand. All the goods and services that buyers are willing, able to purchase at different price levels. Now here's how I graph. I need to point some stuff out, okay? Do not just put price. That's incorrect. It's price level, because price level is the average of all prices. That's what you're looking at. You have to put price level. Down here on the bottom, instead of quantity, we need to put GDPR, which is real GDP. Not GDP, not Q, real GDP. That's what goes on the bottom, okay? Don't miss points on the test by getting lazy and just putting price or put P and Q. That is incorrect. You're looking at individual markets and that is not correct. Also, the other big thing that happens is people just write D here. No, you need to put AD. It's aggregate demand, okay? It's aggregate demand. Now, the reason it's important that we label these, because if we take a look here, let me just draw some points. Oh, what happened there? I won't pass. So we'll call this PA. And the way they note it in your textbook, so I'll do it here, is Y. So we'll call this YA. Just take another random point down here. So this is YB. And this is PB. Okay. When price level, the average prices are really high, right? The amount that we buy is going to be low. Things are expensive, and that's what this graph shows right here. When price levels are low, all the prices are down. We tend to buy much more. And we're going to take a look at some of the reasons, but that's the fundamental reason why aggregate demand is downward sloping. The same thing applies on the micro level, applies on the macro level. When prices are high, we tend to buy less because our money isn't worth as much. When prices go low, we have the same amount of money can buy more goods, so we'll tend to buy more, okay? So there's an inverse relationship between price level and real GDP on the aggregate demand graph. Okay. What definitely does not shift our curve? So we need to think back. The same rule applies. If we went back to supply and demand, a change in price, stay on the line. Pretty much the same here, except we got to add another word. There it is right there, level. So change in price level, stay on the line. Okay, so when they say price level moves, you don't need to shift anything, just like you didn't shift anything in our supply and demand, because it's already taken care of. We need to look at something that shifts other than price level that's going to move this graph here. Okay, and we'll get to that. And big hint is down here. You can already see the reason I put the formula. AD equals C plus I plus G plus XN. What does that represent? That represents GDP, but that is pretty much going to be where our shifters are at. Okay, so before we get to the R shifting, let's just kind of briefly go over why AD is downward sloping. There's three reasons. For this particular unit, only the first one applies. The next one applies to our unit after this, and then our last one applies to our last unit that we'll deal with in this course, macro. So the first one is the real balance effect, okay? Let's say we just give you a constant $50,000, okay? And I give it to you now versus a year from now when inflation is 100%. So pretty much prices doubled at that particular point, went from CPI of 100 to 200. Okay. If I gave you 50,000 and you spent it today, you can buy a really nice car, probably a Mercedes, not a Mercedes, a BMW, maybe a Tesla, a cheaper one like a Model 3, right around there, right? But let's say you waited a year to actually buy this and prices doubled at that particular point. Okay. Now a Tesla Model 3 is 100,000, a Mercedes is 100,000, and BMW is 100,000. You still only have 50,000, so you can't buy as much. But what can you buy in this case? Well, let's look at Toyota Corolla. Let's say they're about 25,000, prices double, they've now become 50,000. You can buy that, but before you could have bought two Toyota Corollas, now you can just buy one. Okay, so that's the other reason it's downward sloping. If inflation goes up, it erodes your purchasing power. And that's why when the price level is high, our GDP also is low. When price level goes down, our real GDP increases as well too. Okay. But it's not going to be just keeping the price level low to get our real GDP. There's a trick to it. As more and more people are working, more and more people have money. As there's more and more money, well, guess what? There's going to be some inflation. So we'll see how all this works. It's a tight balance that everybody's going to have to work with. Okay, the real interest rate effect, this will be more important for next unit, but the big takeaway is this. If the interest rate is really high, don't take the loan, okay? It's not good. So let me give you an example here. Okay, and this is one I teach everybody, and this one you should look for as well too. I think this separates you from a basic investor to a more advanced investor. So we have a lot of friends who like Ramsey, which I think is a joke. It's good for people who don't understand any finances. Okay, listen to Dave Ramsey, then it'll cover you. But if you want to be more complex and actually be ahead of the curve, you need to be a little more complex than the stuff Dave Ramsey spouts. So what do I mean by that one? He is always about pay off your debts, don't have any debts, which in general is good advice, okay? But let's say, for example, you want to buy a new car, okay? And it doesn't really matter here. Let's just say the car is 30,000. So the value is not going to even come to play. What comes to play is the interest rate, the IR interest rate. Okay, now I know Toyota, for example, and others will do this as well too. But we bought a RAV4 a couple of years ago because we needed a new car because our other one broke down. And Toyota was running a deal where they said 0% interest for 1 year. Okay. And of course, we had the 30,000. We could pay off the car then and there that day if we wanted to. Well, and so my wife kept saying, let's pay it off, let's pay it off. And I'm like, no, what we're going to do is we're going to take out a loan for the whole 30,000. Okay. Why do that? Because it's 0% interest. I know inflation rate for 1 year, that was supposed to be a 3, by the way. Let's fix that there. That's an ugly 3. Kind of fixed it. So the inflation rate is 3%. Right? That means at the end of a year, this $30,000 is going to be worth 3% less than what I can purchase. Why would I want to pay it off? I'll take the 0% interest rate for 1 year and pay the car off at the end of the year. You just gave me 3% cash back basically for doing that. Okay. And actually, it's even better deal. So it was 0% for 1 year, then it was 1% for the next year after that. And this is where we really had, I was talking to her because she wanted to pay it off after the second year. I was like, no, even if it's 1%, it's still less than 3%. It's free money. Don't pay it off. We'll just keep paying the minimum monthly payments that they ask for, okay, with no inflation, but I don't want to pay off the car. Okay. And that's the same thing that businesses do all the time. Apple's notorious for this one. What they'll do is when the interest rate drops really low, Apple starts borrowing all kinds of money, and everyone's like, why is Apple borrowing money? They don't even need it because at that point they've calculated it's pretty much free money. It's either at inflation or less than inflation. So I can borrow all this money, just expand right now or buy whatever I need, and then I'll pay it back over time. And by calculating inflation there, it's actually free money that they're giving me. Okay. When interest rate gets really high, companies back down. Oh, I don't want to borrow the money anymore. Okay. Too expensive for that particular one. And that's a smart thing that you should do as well too. Okay. Keep all of those into effect. It's the balance. So if you buy a house, for example, should you pay it off right away? Probably not, depending on what your interest rate is. If you get one right now, it's about 3% for a year for a mortgage. Why would you pay that off? It's pretty much a wash with inflation. You're not paying any value when you calculate inflation and the interest rate together. I can take that extra money that I would use to pay it off and go invest it in the stock market that's giving me 7%. Actually, I think the last one number I saw was 14%. It's on a roll. Okay. So why would I pay the house off? That's less money I can put into investment. So you got to use those to calculate. Someone's running. And you can see how interest rate and inflation rates kind of work hand in hand. It's not always perfect, but banks should keep their interest rate a little bit higher than the normal inflation rate if they want to keep money. Okay. Not always perfect, you can see right there. And the last one here is just foreign trade. And we'll deal with this one again as well too. Foreigners, because they buy our exports. So France, for example, is the number one purchaser of Chevy and Ford cars. Okay, the biggest market outside the United States for those American car companies is France. So if our average prices are going up, France looks at that and says, whoa, those American cars are really expensive. We're not going to buy them. So when our price level goes up, just like us, they say, hey, we'll go buy somewhere else. We'll go buy German cars now because it's cheaper, or we'll buy domestic French cars like, what is it, PGI? That one? I believe that's one. They'll buy the domestic French cars in that particular case. When our price level gets really low, right, prices come down, they'll start to buy more of those goods because it tends to be cheaper. So it works on the same principle. It's just foreigners buying outside our imports. Okay, that's what they're purchasing in that particular case. Now let's go back and let's look at the shifting here in aggregate demand. Okay, so let's take a look. The things are still the same. If you shift to the right, that's an increase. If you shift to the left, that's a decrease. Okay, so those rules still apply. But what actually causes those shifts? Well, same principle here is what we're looking at. These are our shifters, really easy. And actually, we only need to worry about these three right here. As he pointed out in the video, he didn't even take net exports. He ignored it. It was just CIG. That's it. And that's the same thing we're going to worry about here. We'll talk about this one a little bit later when we get to international trade. But for now, you can ignore that for a long period of time. We're just going to focus on C, I, and G. Okay. So here's how it works. If consumer spending goes up, right? Notice I've increased this side of the equation over here, the right side. That must mean I have to increase the left side as well too. So if consumer spending goes up for some reason, my aggregate demand needs to go up for some reason. Okay? And we'll see the causes of these ones here. It's pretty basic as well. If we go back here a little bit, okay, what if investment spending goes down, like the stock market crashes or something? So people no longer invest in the stock market. Investment goes down. Well, I got to do the same subtraction on the other side of the equation here. Okay, so AD goes down. That would shift us to AD2. So that is it. Those are going to be the pretty basic ones that we have to talk about, okay, as we go through it. Now I'm going to give you